Yeah, I just asked Mike to say a formal presentation of Jim, whatever he wants to say. So,
Well,
Mike,
Jim
you're
Sommerville, Jim Sommerville needs no introduction, so
right.
go ahead. No, don't do that. Jim Sommerville is a pastor like no other, I would say. Closest I can think would be Earl Davis, with whom I served at First Church Memphis back in the day. All you have to do is listen to his sermons or read his blogs, and you'll understand why. He has truly made bringing the kingdom of heaven to Richmond, Virginia, a byword in our church and in our town. Being pastor of a church like First Baptist Church is not an easy task, to say the least. Once First Baptist Church was full of Foreign Mission Board employees. Now most of them are at Grove Avenue, a very conservative church here in Richmond. There are still a few retirees in the church. One of the times I was most proud of our church was when they took down the Stonewall Jackson monument at the corner of Monument Avenue and the Boulevard, just adjacent to the church. They didn't announce when they were taking it down, but one day they arrived with huge lift trucks, and by noon, word had spread and a huge crowd, hundreds of people, had gathered. In the middle of all that, our staff started handing out bottles of water to folks milling around in the street and watching all the activity. Then, as they lifted Stonewall off his perch, our church bell started ringing. And I still get chills thinking about it. Huge cheers went up from the crowd. Many people who didn't even know what church it was found out that day. It was First Baptist Church Richmond. It was on the news that day, and First Baptist Church got a lot of coverage for that. But while lots of us were celebrating, it didn't please lots of people, and for weeks, Jim's phone rang with members upset about it. But that's the nature of First Baptist. Jim will tell us more, but let me say that before coming to First Baptist, he was pastor of First Baptist Church, Washington, D.C., and that's another story. He's been in Richmond now for 16 and a half years. So, Jim, thanks for taking time out of painting your daughter's house to be with us today.
Thank you, Mike. Love that introduction and that memory of Stonewall Jackson coming off his perch. Quite a day. Yeah. Well, I don't know how you want to approach this. If you have questions, if you want me to talk about that day or about other things.
Why don't you just talk about what it's been like to pastor through this climate, and then let us, way we usually do it, and then we'll jump in with questions.
Yeah, okay. I'll start with this recent election. We had already planned to have a post-election prayer service on the Wednesday night following Election Day and advertised that well in advance so that it wouldn't look like a reactive response to whatever had happened. We didn't know who was going to win. I was hopeful that it would be Kamala Harris, and it wasn't. I spent about 4 hours on that election night after I had gone to bed and after I'd fallen asleep once, just processing what looked like it was going to be a Trump victory and trying to figure out how to find some peace in my soul, because it wasn't the way I wanted things to turn out. And I did wonder how it would affect not only my church, but of course, our country over the next 4 years. And somewhere before dawn, I got to a place of peace about that and maybe slept for an hour and got up and went on about the day. But when I stood up in front of the congregation that night in the chapel, I said, it's not easy to be the pastor of a purple church. Some of you are.
Told her while I was gone, didn't know about it, but the lady stopped and told me. Let's see what you got. you need any, move anything or help anything.
No, sir. I
This is
shouldn't
it.
do
It's
this.
it's something in this area right here.
Okay.
All right.
So I said it's not easy to be the pastor of a purple church. I'm looking out over this congregation tonight. Some of you are celebrating, and some of you are grieving. And I don't know whether I'm presiding at a wedding or a funeral. It's hard to know what kind of pastoral approach to take at an event like this. And they seem to understand that. There weren't people who were like obviously celebrating. I did see a number of people who just shot me these pained expressions earlier, like while we were having supper. Like, Jim, can you believe how this election turned out? But it's just true. We have people who probably did vote for Trump, and I know we have people who voted for Harris. And there's something about that that is different than being pastor of a red church or a blue church. I heard a sermon recently from the pastor of Myers Park Baptist Church, and it's getting a lot of airplay because, you know, he's the pastor of a blue church, and he stood in the pulpit on that Sunday after an election day and shared very publicly his grief over Kamala Harris's loss and tried to rally the troops to go forward even when their team hadn't won. And I realized that's not something I can do from my pulpit. I can't assume that everybody voted one way or the other way. But there may be some gift in that, in having to recognize that people you love are on both sides of that political divide. Of course, it's true in my own family. It may be true in your family as well. But I have a brother who is a Harvard-educated lawyer, graduated from Dartmouth, summa cum laude. He's the smart one in the family. And yet he keeps voting for Donald Trump. And I think, how can somebody who is smart do that? But he loves to have discussions about it. He wants to talk politics all the time, and he can wear me out. You know, he's a good lawyer. And I get to the point where I think, we came from the same womb. I can't understand how we grew up in the same house with the parents we had and still have such different viewpoints on politics. And yet I'm determined to love him, and I tell him that. Sometimes when he says he wants to talk, I say, can you tell me the desired outcome of the conversation? What are you hoping will happen? And he'll usually respond by saying, I hope that at the end we'll be able to say that we love each other and we're there for each other, but I'd really love to talk about this. So we're trying to stay friends and try to stay family. But when I think about this from the pastoral perspective, I look out over a congregation that has people who voted on both sides. And I think it was Barbara Brown Taylor once who said, you know, we don't say everything that we know or everything that we should sometimes, because we love these people and we're trying to bring them along. And you can't do that if you just alienate them and send them off to join Grove Avenue Baptist Church or Second Baptist Church, Mike Harton. We've lost a number of members during COVID who I think finally decided that First Baptist was political in the wrong way, which means my politics were not their politics, and they went to another church. Some people have left our church because my theology wasn't their theology, and that's just what happens. Some of you who have been pastors can probably tell me that when you've been there for a while, there is that kind of turnover. You come to a new church, and within how many years, David Sapp, you lose about a third of that congregation, and maybe, if you're lucky, the same number will join, and it's a different church than you started serving in the beginning. Anyway, I feel like there is value in being the pastor of a purple church and trying to listen to people on both sides and trying to preach in a way that doesn't simply assume we're all on the same side. It does also force me to raise the sights of the congregation so that we get up out of the political weeds and remember our citizenship in the kingdom of God. That's what I tried to do on that Wednesday night prayer service. I said when I went to bed last night, Jesus was Lord, and Jesus was still Lord when I woke up this morning. There is something wonderful about being a citizen of God's kingdom in a time when American politics are so abrasive and abusive. There is a chance to rise above some of that. And at the same time, you don't want to be completely disengaged. You don't want to have that sort of otherworldly outlook and pretend that nothing that happens outside the walls of the church matters to the people inside the walls. But we can still talk about bringing the kingdom of heaven to Richmond, Virginia, and about what that will mean. It will mean things like making sure that people aren't going hungry in our city. There's a 39% childhood poverty rate in Richmond. That just breaks my heart. I think about how is it that in this city where we live, this place that we love, 2 out of 5 kids may be going to bed hungry at night. That's just not right. And so I feel like you can speak to people on both sides of the political divide with that kind of concern. How do we help kids in our city have what they need to live? So we can still talk about justice, we can still talk about peace, we can still talk about mercy, but try to stay away from those partisan politics if possible. And I learned that while I was in Washington. We had a rule that you just check your partisan politics at the door. So if that began to show up in the hallways or the Sunday school classes, we would just call time out and say, remember, we have a rule here. No partisan politics in the hallways, in the classroom, certainly not in the sanctuary. I think most of the time, folks here at First Baptist are able to honor that kind of rule. Don't have a lot of people who were gloating about the outcome of the election, and not a lot of people publicly grieving, but all of us are aware that it's going to make things different in this country. And I did have one member. He's a young man whose father was a pastor in Mexico, came to this country, brought his son with him. And he said he was afraid to come to the prayer service on Wednesday night after the election as a brown-skinned person of Mexican descent. He wasn't sure what might be happening, not so much in the church, but in the city. And I grieve for people like him, for others who might just be wondering, will I still have a place at the table in America? Do I have to watch out for myself in a way that I didn't before? And that's where I really feel like the church can provide a safe haven, sanctuary for people who might feel like they're not valued in the same way they were before this election. But we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that in the days ahead. Mike, I was talking to ChatGPT, the artificial intelligence app on my phone, and just saying, tell me about the origins of Christ the King Sunday. That's coming up. And G, as I call my app, G says, well, Christ the King Sunday came about as a response to a rise in nationalism in Europe. Back in 1925, Pope Pius XI was concerned about authoritarianism, nationalism, established Christ the King Sunday as a way of reminding people that there was no other king but Christ. And I thought, well, that just feels timely to me. Maybe this year around, we'll say, in the face of rising Christian nationalism, good time to remember who's really in charge. Anyway, that's a little bit about where we are here these days at First Baptist. Again, I can tell you more if you like, but when I came here 16 and a half years ago, somebody referred to First Baptist as the big white church on the corner. And when I look at the congregation now, it doesn't look big or white, at least not as white as it was. We have a growing diversity here, and that's economic as well as ethnic. We really do seem to have a reputation for being a church that welcomes everybody. And so everybody shows up from time to time just to see if that's true. And we practice a kind of radical hospitality that one of our staff members has been teaching us. And it's a good place to be. I love this church. I blogged yesterday about loving it enough to stay even when my grandchildren are moving to Australia, which is happening in February. But I'm planning to stay put a few more years and see if I can finish the work that I started here. Okay, I'm going to be quiet. See what do you want to talk about? Good reminder, Andrew.
Jim, one of your predecessors became a preaching professor, and he claimed to read 5 books a week. Do you read 5 books a week?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. When I was in Washington, Larry, I had a 30-minute commute every day on the metro, and I got more reading done while I was a pastor in Washington than anywhere else that I've been. These days, my house is 2 minutes from the church by car, 8 minutes walking, and I find that I don't get nearly as much reading done. But so many sources of information these days, right? I have friends who do podcasts all the time. One friend who's pastor at First Presbyterian, she will rattle off 4 or 5 different podcasts she's listened to in the past week. People read blogs. They get their information from TikTok. It's a world of information. It's a matter of being selective about what you listen to, what you read, how you get your news, right? It's part of the problem in America right now. Some people only get their news from one source, and it's the wrong source. It's a good question, Larry. Do you read 5 books a week?
No.
No. Do you write 5 books a week?
Yeah, I write 5 books a week, sure. No, I don't write anything anymore. I've written my last book.
You think?
Yeah, I think I don't have it in me anymore.
Have you started a podcast yet? I want to start a podcast. I'm going to call it the Free Beer Baptist Church. And I've been saying for years, that's the fastest growing church in America, the Free Beer Baptist Church. It doesn't exist yet, but maybe when I start my podcast, it will.
Sure it will.
Jim, I first learned about you when I served as the interim pastor at First Baptist Chattanooga.
Mm-hmm.
You have fans in Chattanooga. Are you aware of how many folks that may be listening in to you and influenced by you?
I don't know. I've been to Chattanooga once or twice. My mother-in-law's parents were there in Chattanooga for a while, up on Signal Mountain.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if, I'm sure you're bound to have a lot of people listening in. We listened all during COVID. I don't get to now. I have to check you out later. But you were extremely helpful during the COVID time, because we'd go from a Zoom Sunday school class to your service, and it was always richly blessing, a rich blessing.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. I'm always surprised when I hear from somebody who says they listen in to sermon from wherever. I work out on Wednesday morning with a group of millennials, right? They're all in their 20s and 30s.
Okay.
They meet in front of the Art Museum here in Richmond at 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning. It's a free workout, but there are about 150 of them. And then there's me, right? I'm the oldest person in the group, but I'm trying to hang in there. And this last Wednesday, one of them said, I was in Maryland over the weekend. He said, I tuned into your worship service. I listened to that sermon you preached on the widow's mite, and it gave me the courage to go to Japan for a month and teach English. And I thought, okay, I don't know how you made any of those connections, but I'm surprised and amazed that you were listening. Here's a guy, he's about 6'5". He's standing there with his shirt off. He's got these rippling muscles, abs of steel, hair down to the middle of his back. And he listens to me preach on Sunday morning. And now he's going to Japan to teach English. And it is kind of the wonderful thing about this age in which we're living, that the words you say can take on this life and move outside the walls and reach people you didn't know you were reaching. Of course, there's so many words and so many things available that it just feels like we're glutted with almost too much to read, to listen to watch, to access.
I was
So
going to
every time,
say, our neighbors down the street are Methodists and good people, but they don't care for their pastor right now, I don't think. And so when we pass their house on the way to church, we'll notice whether their cars are there or not. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But inevitably, they'll say, Jim preached a good sermon Sunday. So they're at home watching Jim.
and here's the thing, some of you all know this, but of course, we haven't recovered our congregation after COVID. A lot of people got comfortable staying at home and accessing worship either online or on television. So they still keep their membership at First Baptist. We don't see them. We have seen a big rise in the number of people who connect with us online week after week. But there's that whole phenomenon where I've been predicting for years we're going to see the number in the sanctuary go down and the number of webcast views go up, hopefully, but that they'll cross each other at some point. We'll have more online than in the pews. I'm pretty sure that's already happened for us and may have happened before COVID. But it's, you get to that place where you think, we could probably reduce the amount of space we need to have Sunday worship, but we need to increase the bandwidth of our servers so that we can maintain all the people who tune into the webcast. Just a different way of doing church, and I don't like it as much. I like having people in the room. I like being able to shake their hands and slap their backs, but again, it creates opportunity for a kind of outreach and influence that we couldn't have imagined 20 or 30 years ago. We published an impact report from our church and showed all the states in the United States that access our webcast in one way or another. And almost all the states have tuned in at one point or another. Couldn't have done that 30 years ago, but that's happening now, and it does create opportunity, but I think it does something to community.
Exactly.
Two questions. One of them is a very practical question. The change in participation, how has that impacted the financial support of the church? And I've asked some local churches here in Birmingham the same question.
That's a great question, Bob.
The second question is more of a leadership philosophical question. And that is, in the midst of the tensions, what are your guiding stars for you?
Yeah, gosh, two good questions. Financially, I'm amazed that we are currently meeting our budget. It's the most ambitious budget we've ever had. And a lot of this came through COVID as people learned to give online. That evened out that whole cycle of giving where it was up and down depending on who came to church and when and whether or not they decided to put something in the offering plate. We have a director of stewardship and development now. That's a position that's new to us. Donna has been in that position about 3 years. But she's terrific. She builds relationships with people before she ever asks them for money. And she's been reaching out and encouraging people to give online. So what we're seeing is that kind of flattens out the dips and swings of our annual giving so that we can count on what's coming in. And I think it helps because people don't have to think about whether or not to give. It just comes out of their bank account and they don't even know it. Barbara
Jim,
Thompson was
I wonder when you're going to stop passing the plate.
I'm wondering about that.
It would save a lot of time.
Yeah,
So, I noticed the plate comes around. We go through all this rigmarole like we always do, and the plate comes around, and maybe there's $1 or $2 in it, but that's it. And because everybody's giving online now.
we have had that conversation just in the last week. We'll see. I feel like it's an important act of worship. And I was telling the staff, maybe we'll replace the offering plates. We'll just come down to the front and sacrifice a goat or something, you know. But wondering about that. Bob, the other thing, the guiding star, can you say that again?
In this unusual time in which we live, with pressures from left and right and from everywhere else, you as pastor have to have some guiding stars to which you are committed in the form of leadership, how you're leading the people and what you're leading them toward. I mean, as editor of the Alabama Baptist for 23 years, in a state that is not purple, but red, I know what I attempted to do internally, my internal guides. I guess I'm asking, when you're interacting with these people on a daily basis, where are the internal guides that keep you on the track you want to be on and not going after this pressure or reacting to that pressure?
Well, this sounds too simple, but it's Jesus, Bob. It's just Jesus. I was thinking about how when Jesus was doing his work, Tiberius Caesar was the emperor of Rome. And if you know anything about Tiberius, he was certifiable. I mean, he was as crazy as they get, except maybe for his nephew Caligula, who was crazier still. But here's all this going on in the Roman Empire with a kind of an evil and twisted emperor. And Jesus is just waking up day after day and calling people to follow him and working to bring in the kingdom and healing people and telling parables and doing that work. And yes, eventually it got him crucified, which could happen to any one of us who stays faithful to Jesus. But he didn't allow the craziness of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD to keep him from doing what he came to do. And I just try to keep that in mind. I was talking with a staff member this week, and he just stopped for a minute, nodded his head. He said, Jesus is your North Star, right? I mean, that's where you keep pointing us, and that's how you keep trying to follow. N.T. Wright said one time that you can tell within about 15 minutes whether a church has heard mostly from the Gospels or mostly from the epistles. And I thought that was an interesting observation. But even though I don't always preach from the Gospels, I feel like that commitment to Jesus and the kingdom that he was working to bring in is undergirding the work that I do here. So it helps. It helps to have that kingdom perspective. It helps to think that that we can do our part in bringing in the kingdom. I sometimes say First Baptist Church wants to be an answer to the Lord's Prayer. And that may be aspirational on my point. Maybe I want us to be an answer to the Lord's Prayer. But that part about, may your kingdom come and may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If that's the way we're waking up in the morning and trying to bring that about, then some of this other that can be so distracting and so disruptive doesn't distract or disrupt as much if you have that North Star that's guiding you. So I find that no matter who's president, I can go down to community missions here at First Baptist Church and find people who are really needy and who need to hear a good word and have a pat on the shoulder and a cup of coffee. And that makes me feel like I'm doing something that matters. When I'm counseling with people, when I'm doing weddings or funerals, when I'm preaching on Sunday, I feel like there's something about this work that is essential for life in this world and for my life. And it keeps me going. And I will just say Jesus keeps me going on those days when I think I've had it up to here. He seems to keep getting up and moving out in front of me and inviting me to follow. Don't know where this is going to end. Might end with crucifixion, but it's a pretty interesting journey.
Thing about crucifixion is you can survive it.
Ooh, David, say more about that.
Well, it's followed up by Easter, I think.
Can be.
Yeah.
Can be. You're right.
Oh, Jim?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question unless somebody else wants to. But how are your women pastor friends handling the political thing? Are they doing well?
Well, we had an interesting year for women in ministry, of course, with the foolishness on the Southern Baptist Convention part. When was that? Last June 2023, that Mike Law made a proposal to amend the Constitution of the Southern Baptist Convention. And it did not sit well with the members and friends of First Baptist Church, where we have two women who are pastors and a number of other women who are ministers. We have ordained women in our congregation. And of course, we've had female deacons since, I think, 1976. But Mike, you were there. Lynn Turner is our senior associate pastor, and she is well loved by everybody in the congregation. It just seemed too easy for me to be able to stand in the pulpit and say, can women be pastors? Well, let's see. There's Lynn Turner. And everybody just rose to their feet with a standing ovation. So I think the women at First Baptist Church are feeling loved and supported by the congregation. Allison Collier, who's our minister of formation, Dr. Allison Collier, is relatively new to the church. I think she's been here about 3 years. But she did stand up in a deacons meeting when they were discussing whether or not we should leave the Southern Baptist Convention. And they were about to decide that they would just let the Southern Baptist Convention kick us out. And Allison stood up and said, do you know how this feels to me? As a female pastor in this congregation, that you're not willing to stand up to the Southern Baptist Convention on my behalf? And then everybody was like, oh, well, we should leave the Southern Baptist Convention. So we did. We voted to do that, I think, the month before the SBC had its big meeting. And it's a little embarrassing for me to admit that we hadn't already left the Southern Baptist Convention, but the roots at First Baptist Richmond went really, really deep. I did not realize how deep until I started doing some research. And it was Jeremiah Belgita, who was the pastor in those days, He had gone to the Triennial Baptist Convention in 1844, and that convention would not appoint a slave owner as a missionary. And he rounded up all the pastors from Virginia and said, "Boys, we're going home." And they did. And then he wrote a letter to all the pastors in Virginia, said, "Join me in Augusta, Georgia next year. We're going to do something about this." And they did. They founded the Southern Baptist Convention. The first official meeting of the SBC was in Richmond, Virginia, the following year. And Jeter was elected as the president of the Foreign Mission Board. So that's how deep the roots are at First Baptist Church. And we've had, as Mike said, so many International Mission Board personnel and employees in our church through the years. Really hard to make that break from the SBC. But when it was time to vote this past summer, it felt unanimous. Somebody mumbled over in one corner when we asked if anybody was opposed, but we didn't hear any clear opposition to that motion. So that was important for us. I'm glad we got that done. As I said, I'm embarrassed that it took so long. I've been pastor of other churches that left the Southern Baptist Convention 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But we finally did it here. And it's been a good way for us to really recognize how important it is to us to have female clergy. We've got a big sign that we hold up out front of the church that says, "We love our female pastors." And I think they feel affirmed and really validated here. But we've been ordaining women as ministers for years. It seems that, when we have an ordination these days, it is typically for a woman. And I'm just watching this happen. I was at that interfaith luncheon with you yesterday, Mike, and the new rabbi at Temple Bethel is a woman. The new pastor at Second Presbyterian Church is a woman. The person I want to nominate when I retire from First Baptist is a woman. And just think, 20 years from now, 30 years, will there be any men left in the ministry? I don't know. I do think this sometimes women have always been willing to take the jobs that nobody else wants. And it feels like that more and more with ministry, that men are out there looking for some kind of career opportunity, and women just realize somebody's got to preach to these people. Somebody's got to wash their feet and serve them communion. It's not going to happen by itself.
Jim, I have two questions that I would like
Okay.
to ask you, and they are related.
Okay.
The first is related to my own reaction to the election, in that I find myself being angry with people who are just accepting the outcome as business as usual, and it'll just be 4 more years and it'll pass and everything will get better or worse. And my question at the bottom of that, and I'll give you some background, is how do I constructively use my anger? Because my background is that I was of the generation that was alive during World War II. And I was a newspaper boy during that time, throwing the newspaper from a bicycle. But I read my newspaper every day, and I remember the front headlines about the war between the Nazis and the Allies, and then between the Japanese and the Allies. And I remember how my grandmother mourned her youngest son being sent to North Africa as a part of Patton's troops. And now the enemy that we eventually defeated, primarily because I think the United States bailed England out when Hitler and Mussolini had already taken all of the rest of Western Europe. Now I see our country facing the same kind of threat, except it's from within. And it scares me to death. And when I see either individuals or organizations who just want to go on down the road for 4 more years, it really, really upsets me. Now, the second question is, and I look at the church more as a church universal, but particularly within our country, remembering the history that's well recorded of the Lutheran Church as Hitler came to power, and there were so many Lutheran pastors who supported Hitler. And then gradually they saw the error of their ways. Some of them gave their lives, but it was a church divided, without a doubt, in the early parts of the war. And the American church, as I see it, is a church very much divided today. And I guess my question there is, what can we look forward to with a divided church?
So, Tom, you remember that book that Phyllis Tickle wrote a few years back, The Great Emergence, where she talked about every 500 years the church has an enormous rummage sale, and, you know, just looking back at these upheavals that come with some regularity every 500 years. So there was a Protestant Reformation 500 years ago, and before that, the Council of Chalcedon, and before that, something else I can't remember. But I feel like we are in this emergence currently, and to me, it feels like there's going to be this split between what I would call conservative evangelical Christianity and the other kind. And I don't think the other kind is mainline Protestantism, but it's got to be enough different from what conservative evangelicalism is all about, that it's like two different religions. And it feels that way to me more and more these days. When somebody says, hey, all of us Christians are going to get together and see if we can do something in a unified way, I feel more and more like, if you're a conservative evangelical pastor, we're not in the same church. We don't have the same religion, especially if your church is supporting Donald Trump and the rise of Christian nationalism, and you're all on board with that. We're not part of the same religion. So I feel that kind of separation happening in the church these days, and it's getting harder and harder for me to attend these gatherings where somebody wants to bring all the churches of Richmond together, you know, so we can be united in common cause. When I gather with those people, I look around and I say that word. I was telling some colleagues about this recently. What is it in Isaiah where there's this Hebrew word, lo ami, that means not my people?
Mm-hmm.
One of the children of Isaiah is called Lo Ami, or is it some other prophet? I forget. Anyway, remember the word Lo Ami means not my people. When I was at the Baptist General Association of Virginia meeting last week in Alexandria, I looked around and I said, Lo Ami, like, these are not my people. I'm looking at them, but I don't get that feeling like, you know, we are all on the same page, doing the same kind of work for the same reason. More and more, I feel like there's another movement here that is not about Jesus, it's about something else. So I feel that divide coming, and I do think these next 4 years, like you were saying, there's significant consequence that can come out of this election. It's not just who's going to be in the White House for the next 4 years. My brother, I was telling you about, the Harvard lawyer, texted me a couple of nights ago. He said, I think Trump intends to deport 20 million illegal aliens. And I couldn't respond to that. I was so stunned by the idea. I had to ask him later, where did you get that number? He said, oh, I just kind of made it up. I said, okay. But the idea that 20 million people might be deported makes me look around and think, well, who are those people going to be? And is it going to be the young man who sings in our choir? And what about that Mexican restaurant across the street? Will it still be here 2 years from now, 3 years from now? I mean, it felt really apocalyptic to think about somebody in charge in this country deciding to deport 20 million Americans. And so I feel like there, the Church of Jesus Christ has to respond and can respond by saying, we're going to do whatever we can to take care of the people who need to be taken care of, and to provide sanctuary for people who need sanctuary, and to bind up the wounds of the people who are wounded, and to help the brokenhearted. And there's going to be more work to do. Unfortunately, somebody like Donald Trump makes it hard on all of us who are trying to be real Christians to hold things together in a time like this. But that kind of work is going to be more important than ever before. I don't know how you get through an apocalypse except to hold on to your faith and to keep working at it. But I don't think the next 4 years are just going to be a matter of waiting it out and waiting till the Democrats can recover and put a candidate in front of us, 4 years from now. I feel like there's going to be much more significant consequence to this election. And yeah, it feels like fascism, it feels like authoritarianism, it feels like all the things that we fought against in World War II. How did it come to this country? How have we elected it and put it in office? I don't know. You're about to get me started on a rant. Sorry.
Other questions? Then let me read the tribute from Ryan to lighten things up a little bit. So he asked me to say this. Ryan said, I didn't want to be a pastor, even during or after seminary. Tell people I was hiding in plain sight in law school and moved to DC weekly and found Jim's preaching to be incredibly compelling. The Spirit told me I could and should do what he was doing. It was a defining summer for me and my life. Jim has been an inspiring presence from afar ever since. His work at FBC Richmond has been extraordinary. I'm sure he has had the lumps to prove it, but he's helped that church grow in the way of Jesus, who had both zealots and tax collector amongst his disciples.
Wow. Thank you. I'm moved by that, humbled by it. But yes, I remember when Ryan was in the pews at First Baptist in DC, and glad to get to know him in those days.
Jim, another question.
Yeah.
You talked about being at the General Association meeting and feeling that these were not your people.
Yeah.
I can identify that because I don't go to my state conventions anymore. I did that for 50 years and that was enough. But when you go down to feed the hungry, I imagine it's not just a ministry of First Baptist Richmond. I imagine it's a ministry of other churches in your area. If that is a correct assumption, do you find a kindred spirit? Can you say, these are my people?
Well, that's a good question that came out of that BGAV meeting. I talked to my clergy colleagues at coffee on Tuesday morning. I said, the question that I'd like to ask you is, who are your people? Where do you have that group that feels like your people? I asked them if they felt it at their denominational meetings, and they said, absolutely not. Right? Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, Disciples of Christ. So they said, no, it's not there. They said, this little group, you know, the Tuesday morning coffee club, that feels like my people. This group for you all may be your people, where you can come together and really talk about what's on your heart and have others listen and care about that. I'm a member of this preacher camp group that's been meeting for probably 25 years now, just 6 of us, Baptist clergy. But it was John Ballinger in that group who said, you know, you all are my people. I don't find that anywhere else. He's been associated with the Alliance of Baptists, but he just says this is the group that feels most like me. So yeah, I think where you find people who are committed to the same cause and willing to roll up their sleeves and do some of the same work, those begin to feel like your people. When you can have conversations that are honest and open, and you can risk yourself, put yourself out there and know that it's going to be received. I think those are my people, but it's a good question for all of us to ask, I think. Where is that group of people with whom I can be completely myself and know that I'm going to be heard? And I would say to you, this brother of mine, this crazy Harvard lawyer brother, even so, for all his political views, is somebody with whom I can be truly myself and know that I'm going to be heard. It's one of the reasons we're still brothers and still talking to each other. But that kind of love and respect that transcends the political division is really, really important. I don't know how to do this kind of work without a group of people. Wherever I've been, I've tried to get a few together for coffee at least once a week. And it really helps for it to be an ecumenical group, because then you're not in those same small circles, not in the echo chambers of Baptist life. You get outside that a little bit. And then you find out that clergy of all denominations are dealing with exactly the same things you're dealing with. That helps you feel a kinship. It's good. So I don't know if that addresses the question or not, but yes, those people who are helping to feed the hungry in Richmond, those are my people. The ones at that interfaith gathering yesterday, Mike, I find my people in that group. And who knew, when I started off as a Baptist preacher, that one of my people was going to be a Muslim imam, and that one was going to be a Jewish rabbi, and one was going to be an Episcopal priest. But that's just the way it's happened.
Is that connected to the work you've done with the sermon every Sunday? How you have an ecumenical flavor to that?
I thank you, Daryl. I feel like the ecumenical interest came first. But yeah, some of you know I'm giving away a sermon for every Sunday. I think it's under new ownership on the first Sunday of Advent. But that one's been intentionally ecumenical from the beginning. And it came about partly because I was going to the Festival of Homiletics every year and hearing preachers from all these different denominations and really appreciating their preaching and thinking, yeah, when I start doing this on my own, I want to make sure that we represent those voices from different denominations. So most of those at the Festival of Homiletics are from the Seven Sisters of mainline Protestantism, and kind of interested to see what Good Faith Media does going forward with a sermon for every Sunday, because I've tried to keep it kind of within those guidelines. But Mitch Randall at Good Faith Media, he's got some friends that I don't have, and he may find some preachers I've never heard before. He told me the first the first month, this month of December, he said, I've got 4 okay preachers for the season of Advent. And I wrote back and said, they're just okay? They're not great preachers? He said, oh, no, I'm sorry. I meant 4 preachers from Oklahoma who are going to preach during the season of Advent. I said, oh, okay. He said, and then the following month, they're going to be from Texas. And I'll have to say, my preachers haven't been from Texas and Oklahoma before, so I'm interested to see how that rounds out the preaching catalog at A Sermon for Every Sunday. Some of you may not know what I'm talking about, but I've had this resource for the last 10 years where I produce video sermons by America's best preacher for every Sunday of the Christian year, and offer those online free of charge to small struggling churches that don't have or can't afford a regular preacher. And they project them on Sunday mornings, or the preachers listen to the sermons during the week for inspiration. But it's been a great, fun side hustle for me as a pastor. It's kept me engaged, and I realized when I was at my previous church, I got restless after about 7 years. Maybe that's just typical, the 7-year itch. But around that time at this church, I started up A Sermon for Every Sunday, and it gave me something to do that took about 5 hours a week and kept me interested, kept me reaching out and listening to great sermons. And I did not get restless, just tired. So I'm giving that up now. I'm trying to do this intentional downshift between 65 and 70 to create a more sustainable rhythm of life and carry me all the way to retirement age at 70. But we'll see how that works out. Anybody else? This is fun. I'm having a good time.
Are you open to recommendations for these preachers?
I'll be happy to pass them along to the new ownership, Bob.
Okay, I will text you Lauren Cochran at Yorkville Presbyterian Church in I believe it's Elmira. It's in the Chicago area.
Yeah, I've heard of Lauren.
Okay, you know about Lauren?
I've heard about her, but I don't think I've heard her preach.
Well, she's about a 12 to 13 minute preacher, and she gets it done.
Gets it done.
Yeah, I'll send you information.
This preacher I'm fond of, Kristen Whitesides, has preached for my resource a few times. But the last time she recorded a sermon for us here in the studio at First Baptist, she got finished and I thought, wow, that was good. That was Barbara Brown Taylor good. And I just think she's going to be one of those rising stars, Kristen Adkins Whitesides. So it's fun, right, to find somebody who's got a great preaching voice and a future. You wish them only the best, but you all probably know this. It's hard for me these days to encourage young people who say, I think maybe I'll go into the ministry someday. You kind of want to say, don't do it. It's hard work. It will wear you out. And it doesn't have, nearly as much cachet as it used to have. I think I mentioned on Sunday, Mike, that yes, being a preacher these days is slightly above being a used car salesman in terms of the respect that you get. So yeah, let me know about great preachers that you've heard that I haven't heard yet. I'm still on the lookout for those. You know, Tony Campolo died.
Yes.
When was that? Day before yesterday. And I was thinking about that and how it seems like 30 years ago we had these marquee preachers. When I would go to the Festival of Homiletics, there would be 5 or 6 big name preachers that I just wanted to hear. And I don't know if it's because of the proliferation of the internet or YouTube or webcasting, whatever it is, but it doesn't feel like we have as many of these big name preachers that everybody lines up to hear anymore. And when I go to the Festival of Homiletics, it's usually, preachers who are prophetic and have this kind of sharp prophetic edge that we like to listen to. They say things that we couldn't get away with, and you think, wow, that's wonderful. But just in terms of biblical preaching, I don't know that I could rattle off 5 or 6 names these days of people who would be on the marquee in front of the Festival of Homiletics. Maybe you could. Maybe that'd be an interesting discussion for your group next time you get together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Bob, Jim has got to get back to painting. So we need to let him go. But Jim, thank you very much
You're
for
welcome very much.
Yes, thank you very much.
taking your time today.
Well, I hope that it's been worthwhile. I don't feel like I have much to say, but it's good to visit with you all on a Thursday afternoon. It feels like that Tuesday morning coffee club that I get together with. Maybe you're my people.
We are. I hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Hey,
Okay, I'll
Hosting.
cut out and let you all finish up, but thanks again. Appreciate the invitation.
We're finished. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, guys.